You are listening to I Am Refocused Radio with your host, Shamaya Reed. This show is designed to inspire you to live your purpose and regain your focus. And now, here's your host, Shamaya Reed.
Hey, welcome to I Am Refocused Radio. We are here once again, and today we have another special show lineup for y'all. We're going to talk to our special guest for today, Paul Granger. He is the host of Where Did You See God podcast. He also has been serving in Inner City Ministry since 2005, and he's also president of New Visions Civic League. And if you thought he wasn't that busy, he's still got things he's doing. He currently serves also in youth with a mission in Richmond. First and foremost, I want to welcome Paul to I Am Refocused Radio and say how you doing today, man.
Hey, man, I'm grateful to be here and just appreciate the opportunity to talk. And yeah, it can get pretty busy, especially with my 3 young kids. But I'm always grateful for the windows of opportunity to have a good conversation with an adult.
And man, for today's topic, man, I think this would be fitting in just with current events and just current times. And that is how God defines success. So if you're up for that, man, we can dig into that. But before we dig into that topic, I gave a little sneak peek of what you do, but share with the audience a little bit more in detail what you do day to day.
Yeah. Well, so, I don't know the breakdown of your listeners and how many identify as Christ followers, but if anyone's listened based off what you shared, people are probably realizing that's how I identify. And, I say Christ follower because when you say Christian, that can mean a lot of different things. Depending on what somebody's experience with Christians are, their own personal experience, things that they've seen around them, it can mean a lot of things. And so, for me, I'm saying that it means I have chosen to believe that there was this guy named Christ that lived and did amazing things and then died to give me a path to full life. But if I'm going to say I'm going to follow him, then that probably should be reflected in what I do day to day. And so, when people ask me what it is I do, it could be tricky to define because on any given day, it could be different. For example, the past year, I've been the on-call parent. My wife jumped back into full-time teaching. Well, for anybody that's a parent, especially of young kids, during this pandemic time of life, you know that your plans could change in a moment. You get that call, someone else in the class had COVID, so everyone's got a quarantine, or your own kid comes up with the sniffles and you're like, man, what is this? And so I've had to be ready to hold things loosely at any given moment. But broadly, one of the things that I felt like God's invited me to is just to simply live out one thing that Jesus demonstrated, which is loving my neighbors. And people can take that and try to make that a prescriptive thing or a programmatic thing. But what I'm saying is day to day, at any given moment, any person that I cross by, that's my invitation, is to love my neighbors. But then that also can take the form, like with the podcasts I do, those conversations I have. It's not about doing interviews or trying to get listeners. That's an opportunity to love the person on the other side of the microphone, right? And so, every day I'm waking up and I'm saying, all right, God, here I am. What's it going to look like? And sometimes I know what's ahead. Maybe I'll be working on broadcasting stuff with YWAM or producing a podcast episode, but some days might look completely different. But I know each day I'm trying to live into that call of being an ambassador of Christ. And so any given day could look different than I expect, but could still be incredibly important, incredibly fulfilling.
And what I'm hearing is you as an individual, you try the best way you can to be ready whatever happens. Mm-hmm. So you have that ability to adapt whenever something happens that's, it just happens. Life happens. Things just pop up and you have to learn how to just push through those things. And that's perfect with today's topic, how God defines success, because when you are leading by example with your family and your community, there are times where you also have to go through tests and storms, but you have to find your way to keep your head clear. How do you do that when storms come and life happens?
Yeah. Well, I think the first part is we've got to do some humble introspection and ask ourselves, what is it that we're actually expecting? What is it that we're actually desiring? I mean, when we talk about the storms of life, the times that they're most frustrating or most painful is when we think that we are losing something or missing out on something. We have in our mind what life should look like, how things are supposed to go. And when they don't go like that, it feels like suffering, or it feels like loss, or it feels like failure. You know, we define success in a lot of ways as people. We define success as outcomes. We define success as how people view what we're doing and who we are. We define success off of what we get out of it. And there's a lot of human logic that can back that up. We'll look at people who have the resources, the reputation, and the outcomes, and we say, well, they're clearly successful. But a lot of people looked at Jesus and didn't see that. Jesus wasn't rolling in the money. Jesus had people that actually looked down on him, levied accusations and lies against him. And when he died, there were a whole lot of people that had been following him that dipped, that never followed him again. So based on our metrics of success, Jesus was unsuccessful. But what Jesus knew is that there are actually different metrics for success. There's the human logic, human thinking levels of success, but then his metrics of success were based on eternal things, because he knew he didn't need to amass followers to accomplish what God was inviting him to do. He knew he didn't need everyone to like him and agree with him for him to do what he needed to do. He knew he didn't need human money to do what he needed to do. He just needed his Father. And that's what he kept saying is, I do what I see my Father doing. I do what I know my Father's invited me to, all the way to the point where when the invitation was to die on a cross, he said, if there could be any way for this cup to be taken from me, that would be great, but not my will, but yours be done. So then we get to our lives, and man, we get to that Garden of Gethsemane moment for far less things. Like, God, this situation is awful. God, nothing's going right. But what we want God to do is to make things comfortable again, to make sure we are resourced well enough again, to make people like us again. And when God doesn't do all that for us, then we start to question God, start to question ourselves, start to question prayer, start to question all these things. But the problem isn't God. The problem isn't necessarily even ourselves. It's our mentality. We are longing for something that may not be the better thing. Ephesians 3:20 says this, to him who's able to do far exceedingly more than anything we could ask or imagine, because of the power that's already at work within us. What I love about that passage is it's emphasizing like God's trying to do abundantly more, way more than what we could ask for. So think of all the prayers we've ever prayed or anything that we could imagine. Think of our best case scenario. It's like God sees that and he's like, I understand why you're asking for that. I understand why you think that's the best case scenario, but I'm actually trying to do abundantly more than that. What I have in mind is actually far exceedingly better. But we struggle with seeing that. So really, the short answer to your question is, are we going to trust our minds more in those situations, or are we willing to trust God even when it doesn't make sense? Because if scripture is right and it says that the wisdom of God is foolishness to man, that means moments of trusting God is going to feel like foolishness. But I've had moment after moment after moment in my life where I recognize that invitation to foolishness, somehow I was able to step towards God in it, and I actually got to see that abundantly more. I actually got to see where my human logic, as much as it made sense, fell short. I got to see how God was able to do unexpected things, impossible things, and bring full life where I thought it couldn't exist, like in a hard work environment or being unemployed for a season. Or now I've been for over 3 years now, almost 4 years, living without a traditional paycheck, and all our bills are getting paid. So this is the thing, like success, we can make a big case for what success looks like. And we could be right on some levels, but God defines success very differently. And if we are willing to embrace his definition of success, we're not going to get hit as hard in those hard moments, in those moments that look like failure, because we're going to realize that God may actually see something bigger and better than we can at the moment.
Once again, listen to I'm Focused Radio, talking to Paul Granger, and we're talking about how God defines success. And I can't help but to ask you a curveball question. Not really curveball, but wasn't on a list.
I love it.
But one of the scriptures I say every now and then is Jeremiah 29:11. God knows the plans that he has for you, plans not to harm you, but to give you hope in the future. And the thing is, I kind of touched on this on another episode, and the fact that he says he knows. He doesn't say, I think I have a good plan for you. He's like, no, I know the plan, not the one that you're telling me that you want, but the one that I actually have. Yeah. And there's a friend of mine where we both came up with an analogy or metaphor, if you will. Imagine it's like military style. He just gives you your papers. He's like, okay. If you just stick to what's inside here, you can quote unquote be successful. But if you go out of line of what I'm actually trying to do for you in your life, then you're probably going to miss the mark. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that you brought that verse up, because that verse can either be incredibly encouraging and not because of the passage, but because of our perception, incredibly misleading. And I'm going to start with the misleading piece. A lot of times when we talk about that verse, what we're basically hearing is God is saying to me, Paul, that he knows the plans that he has for me to prosper, right? And I can then take that to say, well, that means bad things aren't going to happen to me, and God is going to make good things happen to me. And that's not to say that God won't do that, but that's not actually what the passage is saying. There's two pieces that when we take it out of context, we can miss, but they're vital. The first is when God says, I know the plans that I have for you, that you is actually not singular. It is plural. God's talking to a people. One of our problems, particularly in American Christianity, but just with people in general, is we can get very individually focused. That my life is about me. It's about my development. It's about where I'm going. And that's not inherently bad, but it is limiting. And particularly when we're talking about someone who's saying they want to follow Christ. Christ called us to be a body, called us to unity. Scripture is full of those plural yous. There are calls and invitations and promises to a body of people. And when we approach those things with just an individual mindset, then we're going to look for what happens for us, what's good for us. But if we're thinking in a body context, there are invitations that we are more willing to accept that we wouldn't. If we know it's going to cost us, we wouldn't if we're just thinking about ourselves. But if we know that's going to benefit another, then we're willing to do so. You see this with parents, right? There are things that parents are willing to give up that they wouldn't have in their single lives. But when they have children, they are willing to give up of their time, of their resources, of their freedom for the sake of their children. They know that that loss of time and resources and freedom is actually going to do something important for their kids. And so when God says, I know the plans I have for you, plural, it's an invitation for this body of people to accept his invitation to seek the thriving of this place where they are basically being held captive, to seek the thriving and welfare of that city, not for their own betterment, but for the betterment of all. But this is the crazier part, right? Because we can hear that and say, well, there could still be some offshoot blessings to that. And again, with like parents and kids, when you get those cuddles and snuggles, you're like, okay, this is worth it. But the hard part in that call is that invitation. There is a time frame placed on it that was like 70 years for when that promise would be fulfilled. Well, you know what that means? That means that anybody that was alive when that was said would either be dead by the time that it came to fruition, or very, very old, or not even have remembered the promise because they were a baby. In other words, the promise that was given was actually for later generations. And man, what a hard call that is to accept. When God invites us into something, that he's basically saying, hey, this isn't actually for you. I'm inviting you into this for the sake of those after you. And this is scriptural, right? You look at Hebrews 11, it's the heroes of the faith, and it keeps on commenting, they stepped in faith knowing that they weren't actually going to get the thing that was promised. They weren't going to see that promised land, and yet they stepped anyways. And so I think this verse is so vital if we actually want to see God work, if we actually want to experience thriving, if we actually want to experience the type of success that God's inviting us to. It's so important because it calls us to something outside of ourselves, outside of our own wills and our own desires, into something much bigger, something abundantly more. Now, here's the really beautiful thing about all this is an invitation from a loving God that does love the plural you, but also loves the singular. And so even in the midst of that, when we're stepping into something we're accepting that it's not for us, God still does often provide such beautiful gifts in the midst because he is a good father. And so you get the best of all of it, but you can't get there until you're willing to step into the hard invitations that God's giving.
I like that. So once again, when you kind of talk with today's topic, how God defines success, what would you, as far as what we just talked about, Jeremiah 29:11,
yeah,
I know the plans I have for you, plans to give you hope in the future. Where does success tie in that? Would you say it's you just doing what he's asking you to do? Or how would you explore that?
That is typically how I find myself defining success more and more. As a Christ follower, as someone trying to honor God, success is, did I, to the best of my ability, try to seek God in what I just did? I've got to make this big decision. Did I just make it for all these human logic reasons? Or did I, to the best of my ability, try to release that to God? Say, all right, God, I want to honor you with this. And I think that's so important because that becomes freeing for a lot of people. Because when success is defined in other ways, you've got to be the smartest. You've got to be the hardest working. You've got to be the best of the best of the best. And if you're anything less, then you're not actually achieving your full success. And that's, that could feel great to the person who's really driven and has a lot of free time and a lot of capacity and a lot of resources. But what if you don't have a lot of resources? What if you grew up with very little? Or what if you don't have the time? What if you're a single parent with multiple kids working multiple jobs? What if you have any number of the limitations that so many of us carry? Well, does that mean you can never achieve a legitimate level of success? But this idea that success is, did you to the best of your ability seek God? Well, that's attainable for all of us, no matter how much or little you have. For the person who feels like they have no more strength, that feels like they have a very weak faith, don't even know what they actually believe about God, feel like they haven't prayed for a while, they don't know where their Bible is, but they say, you know what? But all right, God, here I am. I don't know what that means, but here I am. Like, that's success. You can see it when Jesus talks about the two people that are praying, and you have the teacher of the law giving these big, lofty words. But then you have this person walks up and says something to the effect of, forgive me for I am a sinner, right? Or the person that comes and gives this lavish gift, but then this widow comes and gives the little she has, but it's all that she has. It's the latter in those two situations that Jesus says, like, that's it right there. So the person who felt like they were this sinner who could do nothing but to stand before God, and this woman who had very little to offer, but it's all she had, that was it. That was success. That was beautiful. So much more so than the large gift or the lofty prayers. And so this is a beautifully freeing reality for all of us, that for everyone listening, whoever you are, whatever you think about God, whatever you're bringing to the table, it is enough. It is enough, because if you're willing to give what you have, no matter how small you think it is, that is successful in God's eyes. Because here's the secret. God doesn't actually need us. He does not actually need us to do what he's trying to do, but he invites us. And he's not inviting us because of what we have to offer, because anything we have to offer, he's the one that gave it to us anyways. What he's looking for is us, our willingness to step. And so whether that's a big leap or a tiny toe nudge forward, those are both equally successful in God's eyes, because he knows our hearts. He knows what we're working through. He knows what we're bringing to the table, and he's happy that we are stepping towards him.
You listen to I'm Focus Radio talking to Paul Granger, and it's funny. I wasn't planning on studying the book of Jeremiah today, but there's a verse 13 that kind of goes in line with what you said earlier, moments ago. And that is the verse is, you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart.
Yeah.
I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and will bring you back from captivity. And I know I kind of did verse 14 along with 13, but to make it simple, the key for me is you seek me with all of your heart. I think that's something that is very interesting, because I'm hearing also, see the bigger picture, see beyond what is you want to see in your life, or whatever your goals are, or, whatever it is you think you should be doing, whatever is a tone of be humble, but also like do what's necessary. It's not saying be humble and passive, but be humble and active, because when you seek God, that's not a passive movement. That's an action. You have to make time to seek him. What do you think about that?
Yeah. That word awe can be really intimidating for us, because I think many of us, when we see passages like that, feel convicted or intimidated, because it's like, man, awe, that's total. Like, so how do I do that? Have I ever done that before? Do I have the capacity to do that? Am I only giving God a little bit? And I don't know how to do that, right? So it could feel like that is beyond our reach. That's only for the super Christians to be able to seek God with all of our hearts. And what I'm starting to realize more and more is how we get there is different than what I assumed. What I initially assumed is the way that I get to that ability to give all is I have to become more and more of that super Christian. I have to get better and better at prayer. I have to get better and better at reading scripture. And this isn't to say that those things aren't important, but what I found tripped me up is I was trying to do those things as a single person. And then I got married, and suddenly the dynamics of my life changed. The construct of my life changed. And suddenly I'm having to relearn how to do all these things. And just as I'm starting to figure that out, I have kids. And suddenly my free time is gone. I can't have quiet time because there's always noise, right? And so if that was my approach to doing that, then I'm forever finding myself struck back several levels. But, above my head right now, I've got this sign. I was talking earlier about how I'm having to be willing to release things every single day because I don't know what the day is going to bring, but I know that I could seek God, whatever it brings. And the sign says, holding things loosely. And for the last several years, since the point when I lost my job unexpectedly, that's been kind of my mantra for life, is I have my ideas of what I think God's inviting me to. I have my ideas of what I think God wants me to do. I have my ideas of what I want to do. And those aren't inherently bad, but I need to be willing to hold those loosely so that if at any point God asks me to pivot or to let go of something, even if it's really good, I can be more and more willing to do that. And so anybody has the capacity to offer something to God and hold it loosely. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it won't hurt. And so when we think of this idea of all of our heart, it's that idea of saying, God, here is my heart. Here's all the things I care about. Here's all the things I'm passionate about. Here's all the things that I'm longing for, my dreams and my hopes and my thoughts of what you might have for me. And I'm holding it, all of my heart, and I'm holding out to you and saying, here it is. I'm holding it loosely. And all that is just it's accepting an invitation to trust God with it. And so when I start to think of it more like that, it becomes easier to learn how to live that verse out. You see that with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were thrust into captivity, even though they had been seeking God with their lives. And they were living out their relationship with God in a foreign land with foreign gods. And they were managing to do it up until this point where Nebuchadnezzar is like, you know what? I want everyone to honor me like I'm God. So I'm going to build this big statue, tell everybody to bow down to it. And if people don't bow down to it, they're going to die. Well, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego recognize we honor the real God, so we're not going to bow down to this, so they don't. And now Nebuchadnezzar's in this dilemma because he has to hold his word to kill anybody who didn't bow down. And so he's trying to get them, come on, guys, just bow down and I won't have to kill you. And what they basically say to him is, our God has the power to save us from the fiery furnace. But even if he doesn't, we're going to honor him. So they're basically holding it all loosely. They're giving all of their hearts in that moment. They didn't want to die. They really hoped God would save them, but they were willing to say, but if he doesn't, even so, we have chosen the direction in which we're stepping. And the end of that story is they were thrust into the fire that was made hotter than it had ever been made before. So hot, the guards were dying. And not only did they not die, but they hung out there for a little bit. And then they came out and they didn't even smell like smoke. When I do a fire pit, that whole next day, I smell like smoke. They didn't even smell like smoke. That's how powerful God had worked. But they wouldn't have gotten there if they had held on to some little part, like their lives being protected. A good and understandable thing to hold on to. Now, if we get to a place where we're willing to hold things loosely, to hold the desires of our heart loosely, God doesn't take that lightly. And because he has abundantly more in mind for us, what could come from that is it could end up blowing our minds. They would have been happy just for Nebuchadnezzar to say, okay, fine, I won't kill you. But what they got was abundantly more than that. A story that we're talking about now, thousands of years later. And this is what God's inviting us to, not to settle for our best case scenario, but to trust that if we are willing to give him all our hearts, he could do abundantly more than we could ask for or imagine.
Man, I mean, yeah, that was a slam dunk right there, because when you think, I like the point, whether we live or die, we want to honor him.
Yeah.
It makes you think, well, how many of us are willing to go that far?
Yeah.
Because it tells me, like you've been saying throughout the whole interview, it's like he's embodying us. He's not forcing nobody. He's basically like, all right, here's the open door. You can walk through it, or you can decide to stay where you are. Yeah. And that's kind of how I take it. We can decide, okay, I'm going to walk through the door and see what you have for me, or I'm going to just stay put where I'm at. Yeah. And then it's just question marks everywhere. Versus there could be question marks still, but at least I can see beyond here, because I can go there forward versus backwards, or just staying planted without being action motivated. And when I say action, I'm not saying necessarily we had to work, and that's all we talk about is work. But I like the approach of is an invitation to see the bigger picture. It's an invitation to trust God. It's an invitation to impact your community, impact your family. It's not something that he forces. He's literally giving you a choice at the end of the day. And I like that. I think that's a nice perspective to look at it. I mean, obviously the Bible is the perspective, but I'm just saying that's a nice way to break it down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, I think you're right too, that, we hear a story like that where it was their lives on the line, and we wonder, could we do that? And I mean, the truth is we can get evidence that we might not do that just based on the much smaller areas in which we're not willing to die. And so, I mentioned for me, I lost my job, almost 4 years ago. Prior to that was several years of it being a really hard work environment for a number of reasons. And I was working for a ministry with friends and people I lived next to and went to church with, like an environment that should have been like spiritual family. And the whole time I'm thinking that success would look like my boss seeing me accurately and not blaming me for things that I didn't do. Success would be my role being a sustainable role. And these are that's legitimate things. That's human logic, pretty solid things for me to long for and think would be good. And God kept not making that happen. And I began to realize that his invitation for me was not a more sustainable work environment or a better job or more comfort or more security or better reputation. That was not his invitation. His invitation was to trust him in the midst of the hardship. He kept saying, I want to invite you to stay, and I'm not going to promise that it gets better. And one of the freeing moments for me became when a spiritual father of mine basically said something to the effect of, you don't work for this person, you don't work for this place, you work for God. So what's your boss God telling you to do? And when I got that mentality, I don't have to prove myself to my boss. I don't have to protect this job, because if my job is ambassador of Christ, I've got eternal job security, whether I keep this human job or not. And it was so freeing. And I got to the point where God gave me a heads up I was going to lose this job, a job I'd been at for 5 years, a job I shouldn't have lost, and a job I was never given a reason for losing. And I remember when I was going into the meeting, my mind starts thinking, what are they going to possibly say? And I start working up my case in my mind. Well, if they say this, this is my evidence. If I say this, here are the outcomes. And God's like, no. That's not what this is about. Do not defend yourself. Do not protect your job. I want you to represent me well and be who I've called you to be. And it was this incredibly freeing moment, because in that moment, God invited me to redefine success. Because getting fired is not successful in human eyes. Being unemployed is not successful in human eyes. But God's like, I'm trying to do abundantly more. He had to invite me to be willing to be humiliated, because God's saying it doesn't matter what people think about you, because people thought a lot of really rough stuff about my son, but he still stepped forward, right? And so it was a little death that I had to be willing to step into, to die to my reputation and to my job. But I tell you what, life since then has been abundantly more, has been so beautiful and so freeing. And so I think the invitation for all of us is to be willing to step into those little deaths, to die to self in those little ways, rather than getting so honed in on that big one. If someone questioned my faith, would I be willing to die for it? That's a fine thing to think about. But what about today when somebody questions, a step that you're making because God invited you to? Or you have an invitation to trust God for provision, but you try to go for the financial security instead. What are these ways that we could step into these little ways of dying to self for the sake of honoring God, so that we can build up this understanding of what it means to live for God, to trust God, and to see God work? And those little steps can take us a long way.
Once again, listen to I Am Refocused Radio, and we're talking to Paul Granger, and man, time always flies by when you're having a good time. So before we let you go, tell the people a little bit about your podcast that you do, and a little bit about your resources on your website, where didyouseegod.com.
Yeah, so all of that came from that space of trusting God when my job got taken away and I was in unemployment. And in that space, God invited me to step into public transparency, and he invited me to create spaces to process him. And so the podcast was birthed out of that. I didn't even want to do a podcast, but I felt like God invited me to it. And what it's turned into is a space to ask those hard questions, to talk about things without having to find the answer. And so if you go to www.wheredidYouSeeGod.com, you can find the podcast, you can find things I've written, you can find videos. This is not about self-promotion. This is about, if I can offer that space for you to work through some of the hard questions you have, some of the confusing things you're trying to figure out, then I want to be that space for you. If I can help you to process that, I want to be able to do that, because I know how hard it can be when you feel alone in that. But the thing is you're not alone. There are so many people, whatever situation you're in, there are people navigating that as well. And God wants us to navigate these things as a body. And man, technology has given us a unique way to do that. You can find the podcast on anywhere you listen to podcasts. And right now we're in a season focused on sitting and suffering, those moments where you try to seek God, then hard things happen and God doesn't take them away. How can you still trust him? How can he still be loving? Well, you can, and he is. And right now you can hear stories of people who have been through some rough places and yet still know God's power and goodness. And so if something like that could be encouraging for you, feel free to check it out. But all in all, I just want people to know you're not alone. And if I could walk alongside you, I'm happy to.
Once again, true honor talking to Paul Granger here on I Refocused Radio. Been talking about today's topic, how God defines success. You can find him on his website, wheredidyousee.god.com. Make sure you check out his podcast and everything he's been doing. I want to say thank you, Paul, for taking time in your schedule, talking to I'm Refocused Radio today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.
I Am Refocused Radio is brought to you by 404 Star and Holy Crab. 404 Star is a family-owned Asian restaurant in San Antonio, Texas. We have been a local favorite for Asian cuisine for over 10 years. With nothing but full smiles and fast service, you'll be leaving satisfied. Come on in for some authentic Vietnamese food. Holy Crab is one-of-a-kind Cajun Creole-style seafood restaurant located in Universal City, Texas. We offer traditional seafood items as well as chicken and steak. We also offer seafood boils. Come give us a try. You won't be disappointed. You can find these two eateries in Universal City, Texas at 2921 Pat Booker Road.